Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Brown, for having this hearing. Thank you all for being here very, very much. I think that some of you have pointed out, if not all of you, that the public trust is being lost, and I couldn't agree with you more. And it's somewhat distressing. I want to touch a little bit on the consent forms. I have the impression, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the consent forms are complicated because there is an agenda behind them. They could be made much more simpler if they wanted to. Is that correct? I'm talking about the consent form to opt in or opt out, on whether you want your information shared or utilized.
I believe part of the complexity is the extreme complexity of the middlemen, intermediaries, data brokers, ad networks.
So let me ask you this. Why can't there just be a consent form at the beginning, similar to what I think Mr. Klein talked about, that just says, will you allow me to use my information in any way that I want? Yes or no?
That is the de facto state of affairs.
Yeah, and so why isn't it that way? Why can't we regulate it to that effect? What's the downside of saying, you know what, your consent form statement is going to be clear, just like a pack of cigarettes, this will kill you, basically, is what it says on it. Why can't we do the same thing with internet, with the websites that we use, with the programs we use?
Because one aspect of consent is the ability to say no, and we really don't have that ability. Opting out of the online world is really not an option for anybody.
So what you're saying is, even if they, in the consent form, if we required that they, at the very beginning, if you're utilizing Wells Fargo's bank account, it says, you cannot utilize this information except for me, my purposes. In other words, if I want to get on a website, I can, but you can't export it to anybody else. That's impossible?
That's a very different question. If they're only allowed to use the data for themselves,
Yes.
it's very different from the current.
Right. That's not, it would change the current system.
Understood.
Could it be done?
It would have an enormous impact on the online economy, but it could be done.
And so you think it would tank the online economy?
As currently built around collecting all information about everybody, yes.
Okay, but does that mean it would tank the economy?
No, we'd bounce back.
Okay, that's better. Mr. Chase?
Yeah. You know, there's a lot of discussion about consent. In the GDPR, there's a difference between transparency, which the consumer should always know what's happening.
Right on.
And consent as a legal basis for processing of data. So there are a number of different legal bases, and it's interesting because the data protection supervisors have basically said consent in some ways is the least useful way of doing it because it means that there's no other legal grounds for processing the data. And it was an interesting way that they put it. But getting back to Senator Crapo's earlier comment, for when a company scrapes all my information off the internet and then creates something with it, they actually have to inform me that there's a whole article about indirect collection and processing of data. They have to inform me that they're doing it either when they've collected it or when they, for instance, sell that information.
This is through the GDPR you're talking about?
Yes, that's correct.
And how do they inform you?
They have to write to you and make public announcements.
And what happens if you don't like it?
You can, particularly if it's being used, you can object. You can object to the data processing.
And do they stop it then? Does that stop it from being shared?
If they don't stop, then they're liable to fines.
All right. So this is for anybody who wants to answer it. There were a couple breaches that were pretty high profile in Target and Equifax. Would the outcome of I don't know if you're familiar with them or not, and if you're not, that's fine. But would the outcome of those situations been different here if if something like GDPR had been implemented?
Just very briefly, Europe has lots and lots of data breaches as well. The existence of GDPR doesn't stop it, but if companies
Has it reduced it? Or has it not been in effect long enough to know?
It's actually reports of data breaches have been going up because people are over-interpreting the requirements of the law.
Well, I've got a whole bunch of stuff on this. I've just got to tell you that I'm really, really, really old school. In fact, when I get out of this job, this baby's going away. Okay, because I don't like people tracking me on it, and I say don't track me, but I'm not sure that has any effect. I don't like when I use a website that I get telephone calls from telemarketers on something entirely different, which is total BS. And I just think we got to, the point that was made that we're losing the public trust is critically important. I think the internet can be used to do some marvelous things and is being used to do some marvelous things. But I think there's other people out there, and their names have already been mentioned, that are using it to make themselves into billionaires. And I get no benefit from it. All I get is the nuisance of all this BS. Thank you.